Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. My name is Sam Parsons. I'm a postdoc at the Donders Institute for Brain Cognition and Behaviour, and I firstly want to thank the organisers for facilitating this virtual talk. I know how much easier it would have been to have everything in person. I'm very excited to discuss kind of one of my favourite topics and something that I'm very fortunate to be working on currently. This talk perhaps takes a slight step backwards from the transdiagnostic work otherwise discussed in this symposia to sort of dive into reliability and psychometrics that may be of interest, particularly within individual differences work relevant to transdiagnostic approaches. So I hope that this kind of helps scaffold some of the discussions. Let's start with a story. So we have our grad student with his or her new exciting measure, and they're interested in capturing particular individual differences in task performance. And thus begins our little psychometric adventure. Now, what sort of tends to happen, what should happen, is to continue with this particular adventure, we need to estimate and report reliability. We need to open the chest of reliability, which in turn gives us the psychometric support and permission, in some senses, to actually run our analyses and interpret our results, and even just be confident in the measures that we've collected. Sometimes this will be because a review has asked for it, and other times it will be simply because we don't want to be in a position where we don't know how reliable our measures are. Now, in many cases, we might not find anything particularly interesting. We conclude that we're kind of happy using our measure. Perhaps our reliability is above whichever threshold we've decided is useful. Of course, if this were a different talk, I'd complain that the threshold seems to change so that measures are always, quote unquote, adequately reliable, but we'll park that for today. More importantly is that I think in many cases, this feels like a kind of checkbox item that just feels like a hurdle, a hoop that we kind of have to jump through. However, what people, I think, worry about more is that there'll be some problematic instance, for example, that we find very low reliability, very high noise in the measure. Perhaps this is a good indication that the measurement structure is misspecified. And this can kind of feel like opening a Pandora's box and create only problems for us in some sense. It will make us perhaps mistrust our results more. It may question some of the analyses that we're interested in running. It will definitely reduce the power of our analyses. And if we're interested in publishing this particular study, it may have that knock-on effect too. So then there's the question of what's next. Do we move on anyway? As I think actually many studies do, as I perhaps somewhat alluded to in the previous slide. Move on, continue, or could we perhaps look a little bit deeper into this with different psychometric approaches, more complex and interesting models, in order to really find treasure in what might otherwise be a kind of monstrous measurement data structure. Now, to sort of illustrate this point, that I think that we can use these psychometric models in order to not only kind of more accurately assess how reliable our measurements are, but also as a tool to address and come up with kind of new theoretically relevant substantive questions, as well as questions about the psychometrics or the measurement itself. I have two examples here. The first uses a dynamic SEM approach. So this is a paper from McCormick and Kivett within my current lab. Now in this example, we could take, let's say we have 5 different participants that differ on task performance. Let's say this is just a standard response time task. Now, compared to the gray reference in the center, we could have individuals, as in red at the top, that have a high mean. In green, we could have individuals that have quite high variance in their performance. In blue here, trending upwards, we could see that participants might have a trend in their performance, in this case towards more slowly responding. Or in kind of purple at the bottom here, we could see that participants have a low, perhaps high, autocorrelation between trial to trial. So we can quite strongly predict the performance of a trial based on the previous trial. Thankfully, we do have approaches that can address this. So dynamic SEM allows researchers to extract random variables, latent variables, that capture each of these components, so the mean, the variance, the trend, and the autocorrelation. And more so, it allows, as the authors did in this study, to examine the associations between this task performance and covariates of age and white matter structure. Now, I find this really interesting because what we could do with a task like this is simply take the mean performance and that's it, we're done. However, in this case, we can extract this super relevant information that may itself be more relevant from a theoretical perspective and also to drive future questions. If we find that the variance is a really important construct, we can bring that forward into future research. If we find that groups perhaps differ in their trends in performance over time, this allows us something really exciting, I think, to be able to take a step beyond calculating mean performance, maybe calculating reliability if we're lucky, and really moving into something quite interesting. What was a useful follow-up for these analyses was a comparison of the standardly derived outcome measures from this simple response time task, so the ISD and the ICV. So in this case, the ISD is quite well predicted. It has a very high R-squared by these four components. However, the ICV surprisingly isn't, and actually is negatively predicted by both the mean and the variation latents. This has its own theoretical interest, perhaps, in terms of what components of performance make up this sum score and how well it corresponds to underlying performance. A modeling approach near and dear to my heart, largely because my current postdoc is built around it, is intraclass effect decomposition. For those who are familiar with generalizability approach, this is essentially generalizability theory built into a structural equation modeling framework. The idea being that we can extract additional sources of variance, particularly on top of the usual sources of variance we're interested in when we're thinking about reliability, i.e. the true score and the error variance. In this example from Brandmeier et al., we have 4 testing sessions split over 2 days, and on the second day, participants are taken out of the scanner and put back in later on. I believe there was a recalibration at some point. Now, what this approach allows us to do is extract the variance that is a result of those testing days and those testing sessions, which is useful for its own practical reasons in terms of where do we see larger sources of variance or sources of potential unreliability, as well as use this information for planning future studies. For example, do we need to include more sessions, participants? Do we need to include a different measurement structure in order to account for the variance resulting from those days? Do we need more days, etc., etc.? So this can be a useful way of extracting more information than we would typically do, for example, even through a standard intraclass correlation coefficient approach. One of the powerful things due to the SEM integration is building add-ons into these models. For example, the authors Anand et al. Did was to incorporate multiple measures into each measurement occasion. So in this case, the left and right hemisphere within a particular region of interest. This allows additional important questions around laterality, whether, for example, it may be useful to average across hemispheres in terms of white matter structure or not, and so on. What this again allows for is examining the relative contributions of different sources of variance. So, for example, being able to extract whether the true score accounts for much more than the session, the region, or the hemisphere variance. And we can nicely compare across regions too. There's a lot that can be done with this approach, and I find this really exciting. To begin to kind of summarize, this whole measurement psychometric thing is a bit of an adventure. Our measures can be daunting if we find low reliability, but they're also potentially treasure troves of useful information, both psychometrically and substantively to our theories. What I don't want is for us to get into a kind of Schrodinger's reliability where we avoid looking at reliability, validity evidence, and miss out on this kind of world of opportunities. And with that, thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, feedback, or want to hear more about these ICE models, if you have any interesting data, I'd love to hear from you. I'm online on the Twitter sphere, and you can contact me by email. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you for your attention.